I was born 4 years before the outbreak of World War II in a small West Midlands town, the youngest child of Roman Catholic parents. My 4 elder siblings appeared at intervals appropriate in a Catholic family, but I only burst upon an astonished world 8 years after the birth of my next older brother. As a result, it seemed to me that I was the only child in a family of adults. One of my very earliest memories was of crawling on the living room floor and looking up at all these grown-ups looking down at me. So from the beginning, I felt out of place and slightly alien, rather than a member of a functioning family. Living in wartime Britain could be quite scary. On the outskirts of our town was a large armaments factory, a favourite target for the Luftwaffe. Evening bombing raids were the norm. Bombs were usually dropped in groups of 5 at a few seconds intervals. One evening we heard the familiar boom, then another, 2, 3, 4, coming ever closer. At the sound of the 4th bomb, I remember thinking, the next one's going to hit us. But the 5th explosion never came. As we crawled out from under the table where we had taken refuge, we congratulated ourselves on our good luck. Next day, I found that the bomb had landed only feet from our house, but had failed to explode. Luck? Or was there some other explanation? I was about 6 years old at the time, and children of that age often develop an intense religiosity, and I was no exception. I was an insufferably pious little boy. One day, after listening to a sermon at the local Catholic church about the blind man of Bethsaida being healed by Jesus' touch, I prayed to Jesus, asking that he would touch me. Now, if you were to assign what happened next to autosuggestion or some kind of psychosomatic phenomenon, I would be entirely sympathetic. Nevertheless, after I prayed, I distinctly felt a gentle touch on top of my head. I am still convinced that this was a real tactile experience. Imagination or something else? Of my family, I would say that my mother and my sister were the only genuinely spiritual ones, and my sister eventually entered a convent as a Benedictine nun. My mother and I used to visit her about once a month, and after our talk, we would often go into the chapel for the Vespers service. The serene, peaceful, and loving atmosphere affected me greatly, as did the beauty of the plain song hymns sung by the community, an impression that has lasted up to this day. As I made my uncertain way through my teens, I found my alienation from my family only grew. The only member that I felt drawn to was my second eldest brother, possibly because, like me, he was an oddball. Though he never advanced beyond primary school, he had immense practical skills and an inventive and independent mind. His quiet achievements were numerous and impressive. We spent a lot of time together. Unhappily, later on, he took his own life, apparently because he had got the idea that he had an untreatable form of cancer and was going to die anyway. The subsequent autopsy showed no signs of the cancer he had feared, a tragic waste of a life. Throughout the years, I found great solace in 2 things. One was a great and burgeoning love of nature in all its forms, from the mighty sea eagle soaring over dark Hebridean peaks to the minute iridescent green beetle sitting in the centre of a flower. From a glorious bed of orchids growing at the side of a Pennine lane to the tiniest toadstool, whose wonderful symmetrical structures filled me with fascinated awe. I took to taking long solitary walks in the local countryside, often at night. I don't think my parents knew where I was, and didn't seem to care very much anyway. One fine winter's night, I walked to a small lake at the centre of a thick wood. Those were the days before light pollution, and I remembered gazing out from the dusky trees across the mysterious, tranquil water, in which were reflected myriads of stars, so bright that they seemed almost to be crackling overhead. I stayed there for about an hour, reveling in ecstatic solitude and wonder. My appreciation of the grandeur and power of the Creator was growing. I was also captivated by the gems and crystals hidden in the Earth's crust. In later years, I learned the craft of lapidary. Jean and I would walk the winter farm fields of Scotland to find beautiful agates turned up by the plough. After we got home, I would cut and polish our finds, fashioning lovely gemstones, which Jean would set into jewellery. All these things of wonder fueled a growing love and respect for the Creator whom I otherwise scarcely knew. My other great solace was music. As I withdrew further into myself, I spent hours at the piano, mostly playing from memory the symphonies and concertos which had entranced me when I heard them on the radio. As time went by, I gradually found that an inner voice was prompting me to create original compositions, which I learned to write down. Composing has been an integral part of my life ever since, but you can't produce compositions of an acceptable standard without training in what is probably the most technical of the arts, and I subsequently studied composition at the Royal Academy of Music and the Royal Northern College of Music. My early pieces were almost entirely an attempt to express myself, a motivation which I later felt was self-indulgent and inappropriate. Then I heard the English composer Elizabeth McConkie say, "A composer's duty is to write music for the glory of God and for the uplift and consolation of his fellow men." I absolutely went along with this sentiment, and it has been a guiding light throughout my life. My compositions turned more and more to the spiritual and God-centered. However, things were not very encouraging. Later, I entered a quite prestigious composers' competition. Jean and I went along to the adjudication evening, and I was astonished to find I had won first prize and was now the custodian of an enormous silver cup. I stuffed it into the pannier of my motorbike, and with Jean on the pillion, we rode home. When I brought the trophy into the living room, I was met with absolutely total lack of interest, congratulation, or pleasure from my family. "Better put it in the other room, out of the way," was my mother's only comment. I remember Jean being absolutely astounded at this reaction, or lack of it. As my spiritually rather barren years drew to a close, I felt a growing dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church. I think perhaps a somewhat rebellious spirit was driving this, rather than a feeling that there was something wrong with the doctrines. Doctrine was rarely discussed at home, and it never really entered my head. I began to attend a little Anglican village church situated in the leafy Warwickshire countryside. There was a congregation of about a dozen, presided over by a very remarkable clergyman. He was compassionate, very caring, and absolutely genuine. Really, it was the qualities of this man which made me stay with the Anglicans as long as I did. However, in the end, I drifted away, unsatisfied. My mother said regarding the Church of England, "There's nothing there." And even after taking into account her somewhat polarized view, I had to admit she was probably right. As my lonely teen years drew to a close, suddenly, out of the blue, I met the girl, and immediately we clicked. I'd never had a girlfriend, and thought I was far too unattractive to ever have one, much less a wife. She actually said she loved me, and I loved her. A fortnight after we met, we became engaged. Not perhaps the wisest of moves, but we were both very immature. At any rate, we were very happy, but then a cloud arose in the shape of compulsory military service. I was drafted into the Royal Air Force, and after initial training, was posted to RAF Lucca in Malta, working in the control tower on the maintenance of ground-to-air wireless equipment. Our relationship seemed idyllic. We wrote to each other 3 times a week, and I was completely faithful and committed to her. We planned to marry when I had finished my national service. Then, suddenly, I had no letter for 3 weeks. I was very worried, and I wrote to her several times, asking if she was all right. Finally, a letter arrived. When I saw the envelope, a cold shadow fell across me. I somehow knew it was not good news. Nor was it. It transpired that she had met someone else who was absolutely wonderful. Our forthcoming marriage was off, and I was now surplus to requirements. I was devastated and spent the next few days trying to do my job in something of a bewildered trance. Eventually, the NCO in charge of our small group said to me, "For goodness sake, Hector," that was my service nickname, "take some leave and get yourself home and sort things out." So I did. I got on the plane for Gatwick, then the train for Liverpool, and finally reached my fiancée's, or ex-fiancée's, house. I found that an impalpable barrier had come down between us, which I couldn't penetrate. There was clearly no remedy. So I took myself back to Malta for the rest of my national service. A more resilient personality might have coped better, but the effect on my life was malign. I became harder, cynical, and untrusting, particularly where women were concerned. After demob, I returned to my job with synthetic polymers, and my aimless life dragged on. I had a friend who also loved music. We used to have gramophone record sessions at each other's homes, where we played our latest classical music discoveries to each other. One day, it was my friend's turn to play host. It was to be the most momentous day of my life. My friend had also invited a colleague from work that day, a young woman named Jean Wilson. When we were introduced, she didn't make any particular impression on me. I was still unfeeling, negative, and suspicious. The last thing I wanted was another relationship. Then, as we were listening to a piece of music, our eyes just happened to meet. And Jean smiled. For a moment, time stood still. That smile has stayed in my memory ever since. It was not flirtatious, calculating, or devious. It was pure, innocent goodness. And as I looked, all my bitterness and wretchedness slowly washed away, as if by a gentle rippling of pure, healing water. So in spite of my former self, we began dating and were in due course married, and have enjoyed a wonderfully happy marriage ever since. Before that, I found that Jean was a Christadelphian, and she began a process of instructing me in the gospel. I was not an easy pupil, and it was some time before everything finally fell into place, and I was baptized into the name of Jesus. The rest, as they say, is history. The things that I think most impressed me about my new faith included the fact that it was clearly based on the Bible, which was supposed to be the origin of all Christian religion, rather than on the tenets of an institution. The darker things of a personal devil with its concomitant hell and eternal torment were found to be fiction. And perhaps, more than anything, the fact that heaven-going, never particularly appealing to me, was to be replaced by the kingdom of God on earth. So, my beloved wonderful earth was to be cleansed and healed forever of its hurts and its burden of human folly, greed, and wickedness. Despite the warnings of my new brothers and sisters, there were no histrionics at home, though my parents were naturally not happy about the situation. There was no attempt to make me recant, and there was no visitation in wrath by the local clergy. Indeed, over the years, I developed a closer friendship with my sister, and this continued up to her death 3 years ago. Some weeks ago, we attended, courtesy of Zoom, the Endeavour Summer School. More than one speaker expressed difficulties with the concept of unanswered prayer. They had prayed for understanding and some guidance in their lives. It hadn't materialized. They were at a loss as to how to proceed in their pilgrimages, and they had my sympathy. And yet, as I prepared this talk, it came to me that perhaps we were all looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps we should look back on our lives as I have just been doing, to seek a pattern of divine guidance and direction. In my case, there were certain waymarks, a bomb that didn't explode, a gentle touch on my head, the otherworldly peace of those nuns singing, the destructive devastation of a broken love, leading to a certain smile. On reflection, these seem to me, with all humility, to be succeeding steps of guidance by the Father, leading me by his grace to where I am now. Thank you.